Hello, my name is Dr. Diana Bearden-Jai, and I'm a senior curator and cultural heritage specialist at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. I'm also a textile artist inspired by the needlework traditions of my family and community. And this presentation will discuss how museums can forge relationships and collaboratively develop projects with people outside of the museum in local neighborhood settings to create programs of outreach and mutual engagement. I'm going to talk about three things, therefore, bringing community into the museum space before museum presentations in new ways as partners, planners, experts, and participants. Secondly, I'm going to talk about taking the museum out to the community, and that's planning programs of community engagement through projects and events that may bring some of the things presented at the museum that revolve around issues of heritage and folk life outside the museum. And finally, I'm going to talk about the dynamics of forging and maintaining museum and community relationships. And I am going to speak about this based on some of the programs that I have curated or led in about 3 decades of being at the Smithsonian Folklife program and at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. Community engagement is one of the pillars of the Folklife Festival, and there are three aspects to the way that these programs are developed. Before the festival, in the Wiltor Dorn program, for example, we worked with a variety of researchers. Some of them were folklorists and had degrees or museum staff. Others were students. Others were people within the community, educators, as well as cultural practitioners themselves who wanted to learn how to document their own communities. Others were just interested in making sure that if we were presenting their community at the festival, we were able to present it in a way that reflected what they see as the important aspects. So we formed study groups in various cities, and we went into cities. We went to art studios. We went to barbershops. We went to beauty parlors. We went to the places where people had fashion shows to show off the work of designers or people who made and designed their clothing. And we looked at the venues where clothing was worn and performed. So we looked at a range of culture related to dressing. But we did this with an eye towards thinking about what we would present at the festival. And our philosophy was that there's no folklore without the folk, or nothing about the community without the community involvement. So we even started with writing our own autobiographies of dress. You know, we started thinking about what messages we received when we were young and what messages we received from our parents, from the people in our own communities, and what were the values that they were passing on, what were the criteria for beauty, and what were the events that we went to that highlighted dress and adornment. And so coming back to the table with stories and narratives from all over the world, all over the communities, all over the cities, as well as our own stories. That was the first step in um, engaging community and really thinking about the role of dress within the African American community. These stories and these reflections and these images and videos were recorded, and they were brought together in an archive, and we discussed them. We discussed, what were the values that these icons of dress represented, who were the best dressers in a community and why. And all of these, the answers to these questions helped to shape the festival. Another way that this could have happened might have been to send out only seasoned researchers or only museum staff members. But if we did, we would have created a much less vibrant festival and experience. So, the first pillar of community engagement is what takes place before the exhibition, before the pillar, when people go out into the community and come back. The second pillar of community engagement takes place at the festival. And in the case of the Will to Adorn, we had members of the various communities that were represented present their communities both in narrative stages and on the stage as performances, and also in discussion. So our discussions might have ranged from the way that um, religion or faith has a role to play in how people dress, to the ways that people who were artisans of style sustained themselves as makers within the community. Who were the customers? How did they make a living while preserving and carrying on the culture of, let's say, hair braiding or hairstyling, or creating clothing, specialized clothing. And another topic that came up at the festival had to do with how artisans of style, how people who had knowledge about dress and hairstyling and leatherworking and some passed that knowledge on to others, whether they be people of a new generation, a younger generation, or to people who were new to a tradition. For as part of the Crafts of African Fashion project, which looks at the way that uh, that artisans are involved with creating the things that people wear that on the African continent and in the African diaspora. Um, One of our programs that I guess linked Will to Adorn and the Crafts of African Fashion was with a metalsmith, a woman metalsmith who was African American, but who studied metalsmithing in West Africa, in Senegal. And so some of the questions we asked about there, and what she talked about was how learning metalsmithing in Senegal as a woman was quite a challenge, because traditionally it was only men who learned metalsmithing. But we also learned from her how she was taking the knowledge that she had acquired to expand the tradition to teaching women the arts of metalsmithing. Women were often the recipients, the wearers of jewelry, of gold, especially gold and silver jewelry. But this was an innovation on the tradition. So the ways in which community agency came into play there was not only in the interest in sharing this knowledge, which has to do with something that might take place during a festival, but also in the ways that people would connect with others who had similar concerns or were learning about similar traditions during the festival. So um, this is a really important aspect of community engagement, how the festival uh, connects people who have one cultural experience to people who may have a different cultural experience, but that may be parallel. At the Will to Adorn program, we were paired with people who were participating in a language program, but who also included uh, artisans of style, people who made um, either clothing or were interested in the culture of dress. And so the opportunity to bring people together to convene in a museum setting is another aspect of community engagement, which takes place during a folklife festival. A third context for community engagement that translates to the museum experience as well takes place after the Folklife Festival, when participants who are the cultural practitioners, the cultural experts who have been involved in sharing what they do with others in a public setting, go back to their respective neighborhoods and communities now with the experience of having shared that their skills and their knowledge in a public setting. And at that time, people may choose to create their own experiences right there in their own studios or in their own places of gathering within the community. And they may do so with the assistance of museum staff or with the encouragement of festival staff. Some of the things that come out of the festival with the Will to Adorn, we were able to work with museums that had their own youth programs and replicated the whole research process where they had students go out and follow the same set of inquiries that we made to create the festival, but they did it at home in their own communities, and they used that as a learning experience and then created mini festivals or in some cases exhibitions at the Institute for Texts and Cultures, for example. The museum staff worked with young people in internships in their community to interview someone who was a sneakerhead, someone who collected sneakers and who knew everything there was to know about the culture of wearing sneakers, and who were the people nationwide who were the inspiration for sneakers, who helped to develop new sneakers, what were the sneakers that were popular at different stages after sneakers, which were tennis shoes, came into use, and had a collection, which he then presented back at the museum. There was another gentleman in San Antonio, Texas, who collected shirts made of different African textiles and made in different places. Wherever he traveled on the African continent, he would bring back a shirt that would become part of his curated wardrobe. And so at the museum and at community get togethers, the young people who were trained um, through the Will to Adorn program were able to introduce him and share their experience and have him share his experience with community members. So that's only one place. In other programs, people went to each other's fashion shows, went to each other's presentations of dress. And fashion shows are like visual concerts in many African American communities. So there are all sorts of fashion shows that take place, and each community may have its own style of dress. So we saw at the festival, there were fashion shows that were presented by church communities showing off the beautiful hats that are part of the culture of wearing hats in church to show respect for religion, to present oneself in a way that is, as they would say, pleasing to the Lord. And there are fashion shows that are created to raise funds for a community. So with the Will to Adorn program, we had fashion shows of church hats that people wore to church, but we also invited the milliners. And church fashion shows don't always have the people who create the hats to come to the shows. But there was also the opportunity to sit down and discuss the meaning of these church fashion shows. So back after the festival, some of these presentations were created in community libraries and other venues that allowed more people to engage in conversations about the role of hats in African American heritage. The festival and also museum programs are indeed spaces for community engagement, both before, during, and after community events. And there are things that we can learn about the importance of creating a venue where people feel comfortable as part of the museum, feel welcomed by the museum, but also are able to learn about techniques and practices of presenting, of looking at traditions in new ways, and in presenting back to their own communities. So, like the Will to Adorn Project, the Crafts of African Fashion Project, the African Immigrant Project, museum projects can also facilitate community and individual agency over both the content of what's presented at the museum, but also the way that they are presenting the material and presenting their own perspectives. Significantly, we took advantage of technologies that are now readily available. Some of the research by communities was done on iPhones and iPads, and included social media. Some of the ways that people presented back were through things like through social media, through virtual conferencing, and through the growing recording quality and capacity of mobile tools, which we used to link together several community-centered research communities. Some suggested strategies for community engagement. First of all, at the beginning of projects, get to know your constituents, get to know, who is interested in documenting community life, who are the cultural practitioners that are respected within the community. Invite the community's uh, uh, representatives into the research and planning process. Provide training in cultural documentation uh, and orientation for community students and cultural groups. Co-create museum programs in neighborhood spaces as well as at the museum. And finally, evaluate, revise, and build on programs that you've created, because it's a matter of a learning curve, that navigating through collaborative community documentation project is always fraught with negotiation uh, for space, with difficulties. Sometimes, it's very important for people to know um, who the museum is and to trust the museum. Um, that that the materials were being honored and respected, and the people were being honored and respected. The people who were involved are being honored and respected. Um, Many times, community scholars or community researchers find the research process very challenging. Mastering the cameras and other recording equipment proved frustrating for many people. It proved frustrating for me as well sometimes, even as someone who's done this quite a bit. Furthermore, community researchers often didn't expect, and neither did we, that even if you are a practitioner who's respected in the community, sometimes you'd have to establish or reestablish rapport with members of your own communities, even though they were well respected. For a while, it was difficult to know, or it was difficult to convince members of community that researchers were not just trying to get information to use commercially. So the level of trust that is part of engaging in community work is very, very important. And the decision to meet outside the museum can be a very important one, symbolic of determination to maintain the community-centered core. Other things are, obviously there are always political challenges, there are bureaucratic challenges. It's important for museum staff to go into this with a little knowledge. This work is very intensive in terms of dealing on a day-to-day basis. So staff burnout is one of the factors that museum staff need to consider. You are interacting not only with objects in a collection, but you're having constant conversations with people about things that are very meaningful and need to be presented in a way that cultural practitioners um, know, respect what they do and how they do it, and um, the cultural aspects of this are quite important. So, finally, maintaining relationships with community uh, are that's a very important aspect of these projects within a particular place, especially if you're going outside of the museum. When we closed the African Immigrant Folklife Program, as well as when we closed the Will to Adorn program, it was clear that the program had made a significant impact, that people wanted to continue the relationship, that people wanted to do new things, both the cultural practitioners and people who had attended uh, the festival programs. And so many people continued to be involved and to meet for several years to discuss new collaborative programs of their own. When we did the African Immigrant Program in 1997, an oud musician from Somalia, um, living in the United States, Hassan Gure, and Ghanaian drummers Kofi Dennis and Kwame Ansah-Brew, they performed together on several occasions at cultural and social events at the DC area. Um, at the commemoration, the 50th commemoration of the March on Washington, commemorating the march led by Martin Luther King for justice and civil rights, one of the community scholars and community organizers wore the T-shirt from the Will to Adorn project, because she said that being involved in the project and working with young people and talking about and organizing the fashion shows, which were celebrating and learning about African American heritage, is one of the ways that she saw herself as an activist. So there are ways that we can encourage, perhaps through bringing people back to the museum periodically, by sharing what we learned from working with the communities within our particular neighborhoods or within our particular museum constituencies, that help to carry on the work. Finally, it's my conviction that notwithstanding the cultural and the social complexities, contradictions, sometimes the missteps that are part of real life practice, the Folklife Festival and the extensions into the community can be a means to facilitate shared ownership of the curatorial role, the research role, and to really create programs that are of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that are continued to help to sustain the important heritage of a group, of a community, of a neighborhood, of a nation, and of humanity. Thank you.